Everybody, thank you for attending C.S. Lewis on Writing. My name is Jeremiah Braudrick, and I'm honored, a little surprised, but definitely honored to be here with you all today. I hope you've had a great experience the last couple of days at WriterCon 2020, and I'm so thrilled that I was invited to be a part of it. And also, I'm so thrilled that even with everything going on right now with COVID, that they're still able to power through and put on what I just think is just a very well done and professional and awesome conference. So thanks for coming. Hope you guys have had fun. So C.S. Lewis on Writing. We're just going to jump right in. I'm assuming if you are here, you probably are well acquainted with C.S. Lewis. You probably know a little bit of something. At first, when I was researching the class, I was trying to find out how many books he sold in the 20th century and which ones are still selling today and all that. And I just thought, you know what? They know who C.S. Lewis is. I'm not going to sell him. If you don't know what he looks like, there's some pictures up here. There's some pictures over here. And we're just going to jump right in. I do want to point out, obviously, I have some pictures of up here, one of Narnia, two of C.S. Lewis. I have a few more in my home. I wanted to show you this because I just think they're really cool. But also, it's a great example of modern-day prison art. So these were painted in a prison cell. And I was surprised to get them as a gift from some of my friends that I've been blessed to get to know at Joseph Hart Correctional Center. But I just think that they're normally when you think prison art, you don't think C.S. Lewis. They did put him smoking in there, so I thought that was a little bit of prison-esque. They're probably wishing they had one, but no, they're great guys. So C.S. Lewis on Writing. I should probably start by saying, believe it or not, there's not a whole lot out there. I did find some great books, but there's not a whole lot out there about C.S. Lewis as a writer. And one of the reasons I can only guess was because he himself did not talk too much about the actual art and craft of writing and the way that he writes. So C.S. Lewis, if you know anything about him, you know that he speaks in images. He paints pictures in his head. He very rarely can you find C.S. Lewis ever writing bullet points, step A, step B. It's always images. It's always using and expanding your imagination. And so I can only assume that was the reason why he never spent too much time saying, this is how I write, this is the method that I use. But he did write a little bit of that, and we're gonna get to that. So he did save me when it came to that. But let's go ahead and just dive in. C.S. Lewis, whenever you are fed up with life, he once wrote to Arthur Greeves, his lifelong pen pal, whenever you are fed up with life, start writing. Ink is the great cure for all of human ill, as I have found out long ago. One of my favorite lines about Lewis wrote about writing says, I don't know what I mean till I see what I said. So with Lewis, writing was not only he was not only doing a service to his readers, but for him it was very therapeutic. And there's a great quote we're going to get to in a little bit where he struggled with what he thought until he was able to write it out. And I know with some writers in this room, you can probably relate a little bit to that. So, all right. So I'm going to just hit the wave tops of a short Lewis biography. Man, there's so much. We could have a C.S. Lewis conference, which they do exist, by the way. We could have that here. So we could have a Narnia conference. We could spend a whole day going over screw tape. There's so much that we could talk about. And if you appreciate Lewis as a writer, I really encourage you to dive into Lewis biography if you haven't already. Alistair McGrath, he's a Oxford professor. He has a newer one, about 10 years old, which happens to be one of my favorites. But just if you know Lewis as a writer and you appreciate him, but then also when you know the backstory, the biography of what he was going through in his personal life, which to say the least, he had some severe ups and downs in his personal life as well. It just really makes it all the more rich to understand what he wrote. He was born November 29th, 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. He lost his mom at an early age, which I'm sure influenced, well, I do know for a fact it influenced his writing. He was left to be raised by his father along with his brother Warnie. After his mom died, he described it as the great continent has sank. The great continent is gone. It's all seas and islands now, and you really see that play out for the rest of his life, and just a deep longing for his mom. He went to prep school in England, an experience he did not like, and he wrote more negatively about his prep school experiences than he did World War I, which is odd, but he did not like prep school, to say the least. He became a student at Oxford, eventually studying the classics, studying literature. He wanted to be a poet early on in his life. He did get to publish some poetry later on, but it's fair to say in his early life he was a failed poet, and he kind of had to find his new place once poetry wasn't going to be working for him. He did get sent to World War I. He enlisted in the officer corps so he wouldn't get drafted. And man, he was just really close. If his life didn't take the direction that it did, he was really close to being one of those classic anti-war poets of World War I and World War II. There's a lot of them out there. And if his life didn't take the direction that it did once he got home, then he probably would be speaking about C.S. Lewis, I think, as the anti-war poet. But we're not doing that today. Eventually, he came on staff at the University of Oxford, and he was a tutor and lecturer for 29 years, teaching the English language and literature. So obviously poetry. He wanted to teach poetry and be a poet. He had to switch to English language and literature for 29 years. This is where he did most of his writing. This is where many of you have heard about the famous literary group called the Inklings, and just a famous man to be a fly on the wall there. This is the Eagle and Child, by the way. I know these look like stock photos, but I actually did take these at one of my trips over there. But the Eagle and Child is where they would meet on Tuesdays when they weren't meeting in Lewis's home. They would meet on Tuesdays and they would discuss literature and some of the names that belong to that group. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson, and then, of course, his good friend J.R.R. Tolkien. And so I guess the first thing to say is C.S. Lewis as a writer is he had a weekly literary criticism feedback session, whatever you want to call that. Every week they would discuss not only works of literature that they've been reading, but literature that they were working on themselves. And so we have Tolkien would talk about The Hobbit, and I could go off on Lewis's, as Alistair McGrath describes it in his biography, Lewis was kind of the handmaid to The Hobbit. And a lot of people don't know that it was actually Lewis pushing Tolkien on and saying, you're done with the backstory. Stop inventing languages. You can go on forever. Just publish the book already. And at the same time, it was Tolkien that would give Lewis his feedback and Tolkien's view. Lewis didn't have enough backstory when it came to the Chronicles of Narnia. But man, just if you're ever in Oxford, go have yourself some pub food, a room temperature beer, I guess is probably what they serve right now, but it's just a great place to take it all in. Later on in life, he'd get married to Joy Davidman, an American author and poet. He then, after 29 years at Oxford, he moved to Cambridge out of the recommendation and the support of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is good. They had a little falling out when Lewis decided to get married, and as a whole, we can go talk a lot about that. I'll skip that, but it was really cool to see towards the second half of Lewis's career, J.R.R. Tolkien was supporting Lewis again, and they're friends, and Tolkien wanted him to move to Cambridge, where he would finally have a chair and not be a lecturer anymore, but actually be over a whole department. And that's where he was until his death in November 22nd, 1963, due to kidney failure in Oxford. And that date, this is a well-known Lewis fact, so a lot of you probably might know this, but if you looked at the newspaper that day, it probably wouldn't say C.S. Lewis, famed children author, found dead at home. It did say U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So he died the same day as John F. Kennedy. Real quick, Lewis as a reader. We cannot divorce Lewis the writer from Lewis the reader. He just took in every book that he possibly can. If they were good, he would take it in twice. He would say every 10 years, you need to rehash your collection. He would read, if he had a good book in his life, he would read the same book every 10 years. He was an avid reader. There's much more out there about Lewis as a reader than there is about Lewis as a writer. Famous quote of his, "Those of us who have been true readers all of our life seldom fully realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors." He once told a young fan, read all the good books that you can and avoid nearly all magazines. So I wonder what he would put in that category today. If he was saying read all the books you can and avoid Netflix? I don't know. So blogs. So all right, so some of his influences: Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. He read as a kid in his father's home. That exposed him to what he would later call in life this northernness, this idea of fairy stories and gods and goddesses acting as saviors and goblins and all that. So he described that as northernness. He got his first taste of that from Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. George MacDonald's fantasies. He credits for a lot of things, and he read this before he was a believer in Christianity. But he said this baptized his mind. He had never experienced. He actually said before he was a Christian, it baptized his mind and gave him a sense of the holy, was how he described it. He's like, there's something else out there. Fantasies was great, and it was pointing him towards something else, and it definitely stirred something in him. Later on in his life, he loved G.K. Chesterton, and if you read Chesterton quotes right next to Lewis, you can see that he really did love Chesterton and modeled him in many ways. Other books he loved: The Idea of the Holy, The Descent into Hell by Charles Williams. And of course, I put as influences J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, as they influenced him in very different ways, as it was a conversation with them on Addison's Walk right outside Magdalen College, where Lewis was a professor and a don, that they had a long talk and talked about myth and theology. And by the time they were walking, Lewis went back into his room, and he said he got on his knees and he admitted that God was God. And it was that conversation with Tolkien and Dyson that turned Lewis into from an atheist into a theist. And later on in his life, he would be he would turn into a Christian. So Lewis's genres. Real quick, he was all over the map as far as different genres. I won't go over all the books that he wrote in that genre. I have some of the first editions up here I was able to hunt down for a pretty penny. Thank you, Crossings Community Church, for my professional expense, because I wouldn't have been able to afford them without that. But he wrote poetry. He was a literature historian. I have one of his books up here, Studies in Medieval Renaissance Literature. A lot of areas that he wrote and wrote prolifically that he doesn't really get credit for today. Obviously, apologetics. He wrote a lot of that would fit into that category, even though he probably wouldn't say I'm an apologist. And he kind of distanced himself later on in life from wanting that title. He said something along the lines of, at some point you have to stop defending the truth, and you have to start feeding off of it. He wrote sci-fi books, Out of the Silent Planet, and, there's a trilogy there. Fantasy, The Chronicles of Narnia, and The Great Divorce. Screwtape Letters, I put satire. That's it's hard to classify the Screwtape Letters. Obviously, he wrote theology, memoirs, and he was a great pen pal, and a lot of the great works we have today came from his personal letters, which he returned every letter from every fan in his life, which is great to hear. And I'm glad he did, and I'm glad that people saved them, because we have those today. Sometimes his brother Warnie would step in and do a letter on his behalf and put C.S. Lewis's name, but they're close enough to where it doesn't really sound like he's ripping off his fans. So, real quick, before we get into some of his methods of writing, Obviously, Lewis is just great with just saying simple facts that everyone knows to be true, but you don't really realize it until you see it on paper. And right when he says it, you're like, yes, that is truth. Lewis doesn't write scripture. It's not without error. But if there's anything outside of scripture that speaks to the truth, I really think that Lewis is dancing around it. And so let's just look at some of my favorite quotes. We're not going to read them all because there's a lot on here. And if you have your handout in your app or you want to look at it later, you can print this off, and it's all on your app. And there's some good stuff in here. If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. In A Mere Christianity, he wrote, a proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. From The Problem of Pain, it says, mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, but it is more common and also more hard to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases the burden. It is easier to say my tooth is aching than to say my heart is broken. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. It's one of my favorites. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up in a casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, and motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, and irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. He was married when he wrote that one too, by the way, so he was thinking about his dear Joy. I'm going to skip through this one. Okay, there's some other good ones in there. I'll let you, we're going to keep moving on because I want to get to the meat and the potatoes, Lewis's tips on writing. So, like I said, there's not a lot out there. And, I almost feel like I'd be doing a disservice to Lewis to put it all in bullet points, even though I did. But so I did two things. So the main meat and potatoes that you can find that C.S. Lewis wrote about his method, about being a writer, wasn't in a book. He never published it. The best sources of that were actually responses to two young American fans who loved his Narnia books and wrote him about tips on writing. And like I said, Lewis responded to all his letters. And there's a little book out there, a little known book. Some of you might have read it. And it's just one of the cutest, most beautiful books, in my opinion, that Lewis was responsible for. But it's called C.S. Lewis's Letters to Children. Has anyone in here read that by chance? If order on Amazon, it's hard to find at bookstores, but it's just, it is, he deals with them like they're just little mini theologians, writers. He had a great respect, and you can see it through Lewis's career. He had a great respect for children, and Lewis himself, later in his life, developed more of this children-esque. The older he got, the more willing he was to be enchanted. Okay, the more he let his mind expand from what is right in front of him. And I think we're going to get to it in a minute. But he says something along the lines of, when I became an adult, I put away childish things, including my fear of being a child. Something along those lines. We'll get to the real quote here in a minute. But Lewis's tips on writing says, first, I do not sit down at my desk to put into verse something that is already clear in my mind. If we're clear in my mind, I should have no incentive or need to write about it. We do not write in order to be understood. We write in order to understand. So, dear Joanne, this is C.S. Lewis returning a letter from a fan. Thanks for your letter, the third. You described your wonderful night very well. That is, you described the place and the people and the night and the feeling of it very well, but not the thing itself. So remember that part, not the thing itself. You described the setting, but not the jewel. And no wonder, Wordsworth often does just the same. His prelude, you are bound to read it in about 10 years hence. Don't try it now, or you will only spoil it for later reading. Is full of moments in which everything except the thing itself is described. If you become a writer, you'll be trying to describe the thing all of your life. And lucky if, out of a dozen books, 1 or 2 sentences, just for a moment, you come near to getting it across. So he goes on to write. And this is if you're a note taker, this is the meat and potatoes of some of C.S. Lewis on writing. Always try to use language so as to make quite clear what you mean and make sure your sentence couldn't mean anything else. Could not mean... Lewis, I have this image of when Lewis is writing, I try to remember it when I write. It's basically like a stream of water, going down. Any chance it has to drift off, it's going to. So whenever you're steering your audience, make sure that your words, your sentence, could never mean anything else. Number 2, always prefer the plain, direct word to the long, vague one. Don't implement promises, but keep them. So I love how Lewis, obviously he's a great writer, one of the best of the 20th century, and we try to think to ourselves, man, how can I develop writing habits like Lewis? How can I maybe one day produce something as impactful as he did? And it's just so cool to see. It's so cool. It's not a good word at a writing conference. It's so neat. I don't know. It's so cool to see him strip down anything complicated and just just use simple words, simple sentences. And that's probably why we as readers read Lewis and we love it because he makes us feel. Quite frankly, he makes us feel smart because we understand what he's saying. But it's just also it's so potent and so impactful, but it's also so simplistic, so such simple words. So always prefer the plain, direct word to the long, vague one. Never use abstract nouns when concrete ones will do. If you mean more people died, don't say mortality rose. So this is a little gut punch for writers. I like this one. In writing, don't use adjectives which merely tell us how you want us to feel about the thing you are describing. I mean, instead of telling us the thing was terrible, describe it so we'll feel terrified. Don't say it was delightful. Make us say delightful when we've read the description. You see, all those words, horrifying, wonderful, hideous, exquisite, are only like saying to our readers, please, will you do my job for me? And then finally, don't use words too big for the subject. Don't say infinitely when you mean very. Otherwise, you'll have no word left when you want to talk about something really infinite. Thanks for your photos. You and Aslan both look very well. I hope you'll like your new home. With love, yours, C.S. Lewis. Isn't that adorable? Okay. So this comes from a few different letters and an interview that he did. And here's just some more good bullet points that you can get out of studying C.S. Lewis as a writer. It says, write about what interests you. Write about what really interests you, he once wrote to a 7th grade aspiring writer. He says, whether it is the real thing or imaginary things and nothing else, notice, this means that if you're interested only in writing, you will never be a writer because you will have nothing else to write about. Write and listen. It says, always write and read with your ear and not your eye. You should hear every sentence you write as if it were being aloud or spoken. If it does not sound nice, try again. C.S. Lewis, he would write as if he was going to speak it. And so when you're, I know I often do this when I'm writing. I'll sit back and I'll read aloud what I just wrote and just make sure it has that good spoken word quality to it. And then we have our speak to text on your computer too that does it a little justice, not always. Strive for clarity. He once wrote to that same aspiring writer, It says, take great pains to be clear. Remember that though you start by knowing what you mean, the reader doesn't. And a single ill-chosen word may lead him to a total misunderstanding. In a story, it is terribly easy just to forget that you have not told the reader something that he needs to know. The whole picture is so clear in your own mind that you forget that it isn't the same in his. Know your words. He says, be sure you know the meaning or meanings of every word that you use. And here's a good one on Lewis as he saw himself, like I said, as a guide, guiding his readers where he wanted to go and making sure there was no exit on the ramp that the readers could find themselves. He says, the way for a person to develop a writing style is to know exactly what he wants to say and be sure he is saying exactly that. The reader, we must remember, does not start by knowing what we mean. If our words are ambiguous, our meaning will escape him. I sometimes think that writing is like driving sheep down a road. If there is any gate open to the left or the right, the reader will most certainly go into it. So already we see, even in that, just a letter we see him using to make his point, just great imagery, right? We can all picture sheep going down a road, trying to escape. Already, just even in his day-to-day correspondence, he was a great illustrator, and that was a big, powerful portion of him as a writer. He once wrote to a fan, practice, practice, practice. So I think it's just great to know that C.S. Lewis, this great writer of the 20th century, wrote every day. He had to practice. It didn't come naturally. He had to write every day. And often, I think that's going to be our next point, often he didn't even finish projects, but he was such an active writer and reader that he would start a project and not even finish it. He wrote more that we would love to see today that didn't make it out into our libraries than the stuff that did. But that's because he was just a constant writer and a constant practicer. He says, it doesn't matter what we write, at least in my view, at our age, so long as we write continually as well as we can. I feel that every time I write a page, either a prose or a verse, with real effort, even if it's thrown into the fire the next minute, I am so much further on. Like I said, Lewis would write so much, he would often abandon projects and move on to something else. Also, his personal letters, as we've already seen, were still him exercising his writing ability. And if you read the collected letters of C.S. Lewis, or letters to Arthur Greeves, or letters to children, you'll see that Lewis didn't abandon his quest to be a great writer. Like, even those letters are still really good, very potent. Some of the best quotes we have of C.S. Lewis were just from his personal pen pal relationships back and forth. And then don't throw away what you wrote, okay, even if it's just nonsense. He says, when you give up a bit of work, don't, unless it's hopelessly bad, throw it away. Put it in a drawer. It may become useful later. Much of my best work, or what I think is my best, is the rewriting of things begun and abandoned years earlier. And one thing that I didn't put on your notes here, but would definitely fall under one of the bullet points of C.S. Lewis as a writer, is he had just the great ability he respected his readers, and he expected his readers' intelligence. If you're ever reading C.S. Lewis, notice he doesn't paint all these images and then tell you, now this is what you need to take away from it. He respected you as a reader, and he respected your intelligence, that you would see his point. In fact, he says it often in his writing. He stops what he was saying. He paints the picture with images, and he stops, and then he'll say, you see the point. And if you haven't seen the point, then you probably should go back and read it, because he's done with that illustration. But I think that's another reason why people are so drawn to Lewis is he doesn't do all the work for you. He paints the picture, and he allows you to take away the point. All right, incorporating his faith into writing. This is good stuff out there. If you are a Christian like C.S. Lewis, you might be interested a little bit about how he incorporated his faith into writing, and I think he sums it up perfectly in this first line. He says, the world does not need more Christian literature. What it needs is more Christians writing good literature. So Lewis would say that the world doesn't need more people, authors, setting out to write a Christian book. They need more Christians who are already authors incorporating their faith into their work if the work allows for it. You might think Lewis as a Christian author. I'm not sure he ever saw himself as a Christian author. I think he saw himself as a Christian eventually. He wrote a lot before that, by the way, who's also an author. He would say, make the writing good first. Make sure that the writing stands on its own. The Chronicles of Narnia, as we'll discuss in the last little bit here, Chronicles of Narnia were meant to stand on their own. Even if you never got any of the parallels of Aslan as a Christ figure, he would want the stories to be good stories first. And about halfway through this paragraph, he says, when our Lord made a wheel in the carpenter shop, depend upon this. It was first and foremost a good wheel. Don't try to bring in specifically Christian bits. If God wants you to serve him in that way, and he may not, there are different vocations, you will find it coming in of its own accord. If not, well, a good story which will give innocent pleasure is a good thing, just like cooking a good, nourishing meal. Any honest workmanship, whether making stories, shoes, or rabbit hutches, can be done to the glory of God. So about incorporating your faith into writing, he would say, let the story stand on its own. If you are a believer in Christ or a believer in God or whatever faith, that element will work its way in as the writing allows for it. And I just love that. I think that raises a lot of weight off someone who, like myself, who is a believer, who wants to write good Christian stuff and good Christian literature and articles and essays. I can start off with just good stories first. And yes, sir.
That's true. He also influenced Francis Schaeffer, and they both believe that you should write art, not religious tracts. Write art first. And if you're a Christian, that will show in your body of work. And otherwise, if you're writing propaganda, if you're just, and it's good propaganda, but you're only writing propaganda if you're writing religious stories. Write art, write a good story. If you're a Christian, then your worldview will show through that.
Yeah, and it will. And even if it doesn't, if you're writing, like I have the Abolition of Man up here, which is a great book that our world needs right now. It's not a Christian book, but man, it stands on its own and has a lot of intelligent things to say about our education system. Anyways, thank you. That was a great point. Tips on fantasy. I wrote fantasy instead of a children's author because I'm not a child, but I love Chronicles of Narnia. Tips on fantasy. He says, when I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. He says, no book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not, and often far more, worth reading at the age of 50. The only imagination works we ought to grow out of are those which have been better not to have ever read at all. And then finally, this is on writing to children. He says, let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. Since it is likely that they will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights, and heroic courage. And Chronicles of Narnia, probably his most famous works, the 7 books. That's me at his desk knocking out the 8th book. So, still working on that one. I love how he describes how he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote it as, he says it was a series of images in his head. He didn't have The Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe as his first book, and he didn't have any of that mapped out. All he had was images. He said he had an image of a fawn carrying an umbrella, walking through the snow with some packages under his arm. Like that image, he had that. and he had an image of a queen on a sled being pulled by polar bears. He had this image of a magnificent lion, and he described the writings of the Chronicles of Narnia more like he was bird watching. He was just bird watching his imagination and then tying the pieces together. He says, I wasn't building the stories of Narnia. I was putting the pieces together, the images in my head. There's nothing specifically Christian about those pictures, but for Lewis, being a believer, his faith pushed his way in on its own accord, just like you were saying. He said Aslan, as a Christ figure, showed up on his own in his mind. He had this image of a lion, and as he incorporated that lion into the story, he took on a Christ-like figure. And here's just a cool tidbit about the series Chronicles of Narnia, is he did not have, when he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he didn't have the other books mapped out at all. I'm not sure if he even knew there was going to be future books. And so that's great. If you're out there and you're a writer and you have the whole series in the back of your head, hey, just start with book 1. Then you start with the book 1 and then map it out. He did, however, have it down on your notes. He did write eventually, and this was probably Tolkien pushing him this direction. He did write out an outline of the Narnia history as we know it so far. And so, but if you see those bullet points, he wasn't writing in Elvish language or anything. It was just all right. So, real quick, I'm not going to read all that. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to get to some pretty potent stuff that I just love about Lewis. But I think it's important to know when talking about Lewis, and this plays off of what we were just talking about, of how he incorporates his faith into his writing. And this is kind of just restating a point. He didn't want Narnia to be an evangelistic tool. He wanted to eventually, once his faith worked its way in, he said he wanted to slide in a Christian message past what he said in that last slide that I didn't read. He said, I wanted to slide that message in past the watchful dragons, is what he said. The Sunday school teachers, the theologians, the academics, the theologians that would write theology. Lewis, he described it as sliding past them, past the watchful dragons of what a theologian is supposed to write about. Theologians aren't supposed to write about dragons and lions, and I just love the image of him getting by everyone who would stand in his way. Because he did, by the way, catch a lot of flack. He caught a lot of flack from his colleagues who didn't think an Oxford Don should be writing what was called popular books. Screwtape Letters was a popular book. Chronicles of Narnia was children's books. He caught a lot of flack on this side, but he also caught a lot of flack on this side from the Christian community. A, because he wasn't a theologian, but B, when C.S. Lewis, I'm getting off track here, but when C.S. Lewis first had a deal in America, I think it might have been the Screwtape Letters. That was his first release in America. His picture wasn't on any of the book jackets because he couldn't find a picture where he didn't have a cigarette or a beer in his hand, which just makes me love him all the more. So he wanted his readers to grow up and encounter Christ and then think, yes, I've heard of him before. Something got slipped into my psyche. And his secretary, Walter Huber, said, after reading Narnia, it was afterwards, minutes or hours or perhaps even years afterwards, that the two worlds would be combined, would be joined in our own minds. But, like I said, he wanted the stories first just to be great works of literature. He wanted great stories first. So I'm not going to read all of these, but just some of my favorite examples of Lewis sliding his faith into his children's work. And I know I'm spending a lot of times on the Chronicles of Narnia just because that's what he's most well known for. We could do a class on each of his books. I couldn't, but someone could do a class on each and every one of his works. So one of my favorite ones is it just shows Lewis's ever-expanding view of God, view of literature. He never settled and said, this is all I ever need to know, and this is all I ever need to learn. He was constantly allowing himself to be enchanted, allowing his mind to grow, whether it's through his faith or becoming more childlike, love for other people. He was constantly growing and constantly learning. And we have this from Prince Caspian. When Lucy had not seen Aslan in a long time, she hugged him and said, "Aslan," said Lucy, "you're bigger." Aslan replied, "That is because you are older, little one." She said, "Not because you are?" "I am not," he said. "But every year you grow, you will find me bigger." So every year we grow, in this context, every year we grow, we're to find God bigger. We're to shatter our old views of God and expand our minds and let God grow in our minds and take these kind of childish I'm not going to start preaching. So, let's see. "It isn't Narnia, sobbed Lucy. "It's you. We shan't meet you there." This is when they're going home at the end of the voyage of Dawn Treader, the children of Eve and the daughters of Adam. Aslan says, "But you shall meet me there, dear one." Are you there too?" said Edmund. "I am," said Aslan, "but there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. That was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me there better." So we're going to jump to my favorite one. It's my favorite line in all of literature, by the way. It's at the last battle, last book of the Chronicles of Narnia, the last paragraph. "And as he spoke," I'm a softie, sorry. About this, I'm not having repressive childhood memories or anything. So, as he spoke, he no longer looked like them. I'm going to start over. "As he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. As for us, this is the end of all stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All of their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last, they are beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has ever read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before." So I'm going to skip over this point, but I really encourage you to take some time and spend with what Lewis was talking about, pointing to the thing itself. Lewis saw books, and I'll read this one quote. Lewis saw books, he saw art, poetry, music. He saw all these as not the thing itself, as just conduits to the real thing itself. It shouldn't solve the issues in our head. It should point towards something bigger than ourselves. It should arouse us for something much greater than what we find right in front of us in that form of art. He says, "The books are the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never visited." The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is morning. And I'll end with this. One of my favorite poems. Let's You can find it on Addison's Walk, where I told you earlier, where he walked with Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, right outside Magdalen College in Oxford. It was the spot where Lewis moved from atheism to theism, or the event that spurred that on anyways. And you can't find much about Lewis at Oxford, believe it or not. There's a few things, if you know where to look. But every once in a while, like I said, if you know where to look, you can find it. And this was a plaque that our professors, Robert Banks and his wife, Linda, which I'm recording this for them right now, I guess, showed to us. And it said, it's called What the Bird Said Early in the Year. He said, I heard in Addison's Walk a bird sing clear. This year, the summer will come true. This year. Winds will not strip the blossoms from the apple trees this year, nor want of rain destroy the peas. This year's time's nature will no more defeat you, nor all the promised moments in their passing cheat you. This time they will not lead you round and back to autumn 1 year older by the well-worn track. This year, as all these flowers foretell, we shall escape the circle and undo the spell. Often deceived, yet open once again your heart. Quick, the gates are drawn apart. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed C.S. Lewis on writing. Obviously, there's a whole lot more we could go into, but I just try to hit some wave tops of some very, very high wave tops. If you want to hang out and talk anymore, have any questions, I'll be glad to answer those questions. If you want to see these books up here, you're welcome to come up here, and I appreciate you guys coming. So, I do have a book. You know what's funny is, well, I won't sell it. My book's out there. I was about to say that poem that I just read. I can't find that printed anywhere. Like I found it online in a few spots, but every time I found it, it was referencing this little stop in Addison's Walk, and so it is printed now, and with permission from the C.S. Lewis Company, but I have that in the book. And I talk a lot about my journey with C.S. Lewis, and it's definitely more about C.S. Lewis and me, but just how he impacted me, and hopefully I wrote it in a way where he might impact you as well. So thank you guys so much. Have a good lunch.